Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. I also upload technique videos on Tuesdays, and for both kinds of videos, I will have direct links down in the video description that allow you to jump from one section to another in case you want to rewatch a section or jump to the next section. So this week I have a few things I want to share. I have a couple of little knitting tidbits that came across my feed this week. I want to talk about some changes I'm thinking about making in the Technique Tuesday videos. I want to update you on my Finish It February project. And then I want to talk about my vintage sweater project and also talk a little bit about vintage yarns and vintage knitting manuals. So let's get started. This week in my Twitter feed, I saw an announcement that the Oxford English Dictionary will be adding a new abbreviation to their dictionary sometime next month. They announced it a year ago that they had requested words and terms and abbreviations that people might use in their hobbies. And so hundreds of people submitted ideas. And one of the ideas that they accepted and they're going to be including, adding to the Oxford English Dictionary is UFO, meaning unfinished object, which is what we are doing in Finish It February, is we're pulling out our UFOs and then addressing them and deciding whether or not to finish them. I thought that was really cool, so I thought I'd share it with you. And I will leave a link down in the description below so you can read the article that talks about it. The second thing that came up to me sounds really interesting. And if you live in the Twin Cities and you are available on Tuesday, February 11th at 7 p.m. and can make it to the Textile Center, you might want to see this. But if you don't live in the area and are interested, I'll leave a link down to an article about this. It's called Hot Wire Machine Knitting. And some people at the University of Minnesota are doing research to create medical devices made from what is essentially knitted fabric, but made with this wire. And so they can create this kind of like mesh tube that you could slip on, say, your leg and easily slip it on, and then it could be shrunk without applying like too much heat or anything, that it can easily be shrunk and then create some compression on that body part. So they're looking at it in different ways to be used in different sorts of medical devices, and it could be really interesting. But again, I'll leave an article down below if it's something that you're interested in hearing about, whether you live in the Twin Cities or not. So this week marks the 3rd anniversary of when I started posting weekly technique videos on YouTube. I'd had my YouTube channel since 2007, and over the years I used it intermittently to post videos, sometimes in conjunction with my Ask a Knitter columns that I did on the Ravelry newsletter. And other times it would be as a reference for a class I was teaching, and that was the intent, was just for those 8 people taking that class could come look at that video. And then other times I would come across a technique that I thought was so interesting and was really worth sharing with the world, and so I would do that. But it was never a consistent thing until 3 years ago when I made that decision to post weekly videos. So when I came back to knitting in 2005, I'd been on kind of a 5-year hiatus when I was focusing more on other creative outlets. And I came back to knitting, and I wanted to make sure that I kept the joy in my knitting, because I'd kind of gotten burned out in another creative area. I was writing fiction, and I basically had destroyed my love of writing fiction, and I did not want to destroy my love of knitting. And so I made a promise to myself to, if it ever felt like it was getting too much or it felt wrong or I hated it, that I didn't have to do that and I could back away. I wanted to continue loving knitting and to find the joy in it. So anytime I add another thing to my knitting life, I really think about whether or not this is going to continue the joy or if it's going to be an issue. And so after 3 years, I'm like, it's starting to get a little bit of a grind to week after week after week come up with a new video, because these aren't things that I'm teaching that I've been teaching in a class over and over again to dozens of or hundreds of students and that I can just spew out by rote. These are things every single week I'm thinking about, what can I teach this week? And how do I want to approach teaching it? And I have to figure all of that out every week for each of the techniques. These are techniques I'm familiar with, I use all the time, but I haven't necessarily taught them to anybody else. So I have to really think about that and think about it in the context of knitting in general and how it's related to other techniques. What are the advantages? What are the disadvantages? And how do I present that material in a way that makes sense from beginning to end? So that takes a lot of mental energy, but it also takes a lot of time. Like, this is all I do on Tuesday is a technique video. And the day before, I've probably been spending a lot of my knitting time working swatches to use to present in the video itself. So I usually have several days ramping up to Tuesday and then all day Tuesday. So I need to not do it at that pace anymore. I have that expectation that there will be another video on Tuesday, there will be another video on Tuesday. And part of the reason is just a little bit of a grind, but also the ideas that I have for videos going forward, some of them are just bigger ideas that are more complex, and I'm not really sure how I want to do them and how I would present them, and would they be longer format or just multi-part, or I just don't know. So I'm giving myself time to figure out how I'm going to present videos and not putting an expectation on myself that there has to be one every Tuesday. Again, I'm not quitting Technique Tuesday videos. It's just that they probably aren't going to be coming out every single week. And I'm not going to push myself if I have to be out of town for a week. Oh my gosh, I gotta not only do this week's technique video, but also next week so that it's ready and can be posted while I'm out of town. Just not going to put that on myself, because there's no joy in that. So I just wanted to make you aware that they're not going away, but they are going to be continuing to come in a different pace and perhaps in a different way. I'm still working that out. So it's Finish It February. This is the first week of Finish It February, and I finished something. I don't have a lot this year in my Finish It, in my UFO pile, but I did have this. And this is something that's been hanging over my head since last summer when I put it to the side. But I put it to the side knowing that if I didn't get to it before February, I would get to it in February. That's what Finish It February is for. So this is a pillow. The back is just a slip stitch pattern. And then the front includes that slip stitch pattern, plus it includes a brioche pattern. And you might be able to see, it's really easy to see this on camera. It's not as easy to see it in person if you have to get it at the right angle. But you can see right here, this row looks a little different. So I saw that mistake when I was probably about half, I think I'd finished the back and I was about halfway up the front, and I saw the error and I was not happy about it. And we were on our way to visit the daughter who's going to receive this pillow. And I showed it to her. She's like, I can't see the mistake. And I said, it's right here. And she's like, whatever. She said, don't rip it out and fix it. And so I finished the piece. And then I went to sew the two pieces together, and there were different sizes. And I was trying to figure out how that happened. And I'm not 100% sure. I have some suspicions. First of all, the pattern was originally written for a pillow that was 18 by 18 inches big. And I had this pillow form, which was not 18 by 18. So I looked at the information in the pattern and gave stockinette gauge only. And yet stockinette is not either of the stitch patterns that are in here. The reason they would have done that is that whatever needle it would take you to get that stockinette gauge would be the needle that you would need to get these two stitch patterns, but it didn't tell you what the gauge was. So I had to kind of use some percentages, try to figure out, you know, how many stitches they were using to get something that wide, and then how do I scale it down to the pillow I have. In my Ravelry notebook, I wrote down that this pillow was 14 inches by 14 inches. It is in fact 16 inches by 16 inches. So I don't know if the reason that the two pieces were different is because I made one of them to fit a 14-inch pillow and the other to fit a 16-inch. I don't know what the reason is. I haven't gone back and tried to figure it out. But what I do know is that the combination of having the mistake and then the two pieces not being the same size made me put it in a timeout. When I took it out, I had to refresh my memory on really what the issue was and how I was going to solve it. So I got the pillow, I measured it, 16 inches, and this front right here was 16 inches wide, but the back was not. The back was the one that was narrower. So what I decided to do was I wasn't going to rip anything out. First thing I was going to do is see if blocking could take care of it. This is wool, so it's going to be really amenable to blocking. And one of the things that happens when you soak wool is that, first of all, it becomes very stretchy. It's really malleable. But also the fabric relaxes when you wash it. And since this wasn't going to be washed after it was sewn together, I really needed to wash it ahead of time and before I seamed it. So I did that, and with the front piece, I was able to just pin it down on a blocking pad. I have this pad, it's really for quilters, it's like for an ironing board, and it's got grid lines on it, and it really helps me lay things out so I can see how wide they are. So I laid out the front piece to 16 by 16. I did not need any stretching. I just needed to uncurl the edges and pin them down. And then for the back part, that was entirely the slip stitch pattern, that one I had to aggressively block. And I was able to block it to 16 inches wide. And after it dried, it stayed pretty much as wide as it was, and I thought, well, I'm going to try seaming it up and see what happens. Because what I was afraid was going to happen was that when the two sides were sewn, it would certainly surround the circumference of the pillow, but I was worried that the front would be wrapping around to the back and that the side seams wouldn't stay on the side, and then that would mess with the corners here. So I didn't know what was going on, but it worked out really well. I just watched some forensic files the other night while I was sewing it up, and it all came together really well. I sent a picture of it to my daughter, and she was like, "Yeah, it's so pretty. I can't wait. I'm so excited." So she still can't see the error, so I sent her another photo that has an arrow in it that shows her where it is. And I know I shouldn't do that. They always say don't show people the mistakes because they don't notice them. To me, it is so noticeable that I feel like I need to let people know that I'm aware that it's there, so they don't go, "Dude, what's that?" Now, this is the same daughter that I am making that top-down sweater for, and a couple of weeks ago I mentioned that, I think I'm at the right point to start the bottom ribbing, and I'm not really sure how long to make the sleeves, and I'd written all her measurements down when she was home at Thanksgiving, and I don't know what I did with them. And I was just kind of stalling doing the finishing because I was thinking, if I send it to her and it's too short, it's too long, then I've got to rip back and then reknit, because the button bands, in order to change the length, I would have to rip out the button bands, which is a lot of work. Two of you said, "Why don't you just mail it to her and have her try it on?" I was like, that's a good idea. So I'm going to ship this pillow to her, and I'm going to ship the unfinished sweater and have her try it on, and then I can be sure that when I finish that sweater, it will be the right length. Last week, I showed you a pair of purple mittens I had knit. I had knit them starting with a provisional cast on at the wrist and knit the entire mitten, but not the cuffs. And the plan was that the next day I would go to the Textile Center. I'd signed up to participate in this event where I could knit the cuffs on the pair of mittens using a novelty yarn that was hand spun and incorporated wolf fur. And the wolf fur is regulated because it's an endangered species. So if you ever buy a wolf fur off Etsy or someplace like that, it's probably from a wolf dog hybrid. It's not 100% wolf because that would be illegal. So we have special government permission. The Wolf Center got permission to use this wolf fur in this hand spun yarn that is then made into items that go back to the Wolf Center and is sold. So these items can only be sold to people who are living in the United States that cannot leave the country. So it's all special, and so that's why we had to go there and get the yarn and knit it while we were there. We couldn't leave, take it home, and never come back with it, or come back with only some of it. So they wanted to extend the wool fur as far as possible, which is why they were spinning it into a novelty yarn that included other colored fibers and things like that, because this is the third year that they're doing this. The first year was an experiment. They don't normally collect the fur off the wolves. The wolves are blowing their coats in the springs, and the caretakers brush their fur to help them lose their coats, but they don't really normally save that fur except for small samples for their lab. So it was an experiment that first year, and they knit a pair of mittens or a hat or something like that, and it sold in the auction for like $300. So like, oh, there is an interest in this. They began actually collecting the wolf fur, and they keep it separated by individual wolf. They respect the relationships within the pack. So if there are certain wolves that, like the pack leader or it's a very individual wolf, then they will keep that fur separate and only spin fur from one wolf from that particular wolf in that bit of yarn. If there are litter mates or something like that, they might put those two, blend the fur from those two wolves together in another bit of hand spun yarn. So the yarn was core spun, so there's like a core strand, and then the bits of colored fiber and the wolf fur are spun into that, and then it was plied together with a solid color of another yarn. So what I got to do, because they don't know what color mittens you're going to make, and so there were 15 people were expected to come, so I think they had 31 little kits, cuff kits, and each kit included information about who the wolf was that your yarn came from, and you had two little balls that were 8 yards apiece. So the first thing I did was just swatch it to see if it was the same gauge or comparable gauge to my purple yarn. So I knit the mittens ahead of time, and Friday night I decided to go ahead and knit a few rounds of ribbing with the purple yarn, because I didn't know how far that wolf fur was going to actually go. And then I reserved some of the purple yarn in case I could knit it in conjunction with the wolf fur, like if I could do a Latvian braid or if I could do corrugated ribbing or something like that. I didn't know if I'd be able to mix the two yarns together in any way. And if I couldn't, then my plan was, and this is what I ended up doing, I knit a few more rounds on the cuff. So I ended up altogether with 11 rounds in this bulky purple yarn. I did a turning round, and then I added the wolf yarn and I knit a garter stitch cuff back and forth. I'd reserved a tiny bit of the purple yarn that I used to bind off at the edges. So I'll show you what my mittens look like, and then I'll show you what some of the other mittens look like. It was really interesting to see all of the different ideas that people had with the mittens that they brought with them, and then the different ways that they incorporated the wolf fur into their mittens. One of the things that they are doing this year, because they decided, because the second year was a very successful year for items that included wolf fur, and they decided to expand it further. And so there was sort of a theme of the pack leader. And so Shalon, who's the woman who's organizing all of this, she reached out to people in the spinning community who are considered pack leaders. And she got responses back from 5 of the really big names in spinning, including Judith McKenzie and Linda Ligon, and people like that, who were very excited to participate as well. And then we have this group who did the mittens, and they have some people doing little jewelry items. Our yarn that we used was a novelty yarn that included some wolf fur, but some of the spinners who did all the spinning of the yarn did do some spinning of yarn that was completely wolf fur and incorporated into some stranded colorwork items, including some hats and some other items. They were going to do some jewelry items, I think, as well. So a lot of really interesting things. And then at the same time, the March issue of Ply magazine is going to be on fur, and Shalon wrote an article for them. And because that article is coming out and there's just going to be more awareness of this whole project, they delayed the silent auction. Normally it's in February, and they delayed it so that it's a week after Ply magazine comes out. So as we get closer to the date, I'll let you guys know, and you can kind of see what items are going to be available, because there's going to be some really cool stuff, not just the mittens that we did this past weekend, but other really interesting items that are done by people who actually did the spinning of the yarn, as well as some of the really big names in hand spinning. So it's something to look forward to. And it was a really fun thing to do, and it was such a creative way of, giving yourself some boundaries. Like, I had 3 or 4 different ideas for what I could do depending on what I ended up with, and then figuring out how to work with what I was given in the quantity that I was given. It was a really fun creative exercise. I'm really happy I did it. And it was fun to sit there for 4 hours in the Textile Center chatting with other knitters too. I didn't know who else was going to be there. And my friend Celeste was there. She's president of the Weavers Guild. And then Valerie was there. She's on the same committee I'm on for the knitting retreat we do for the Guild in the fall. So it was fun. It was fun to just show up, not know who was going to be there, and to see all of the different creative ideas that other people had as well. So I am nearly up to the underarms on the sweater back of my vintage sweater. I've got the second blue V done, and what I've got up here, I've got a black stripe with a few rows of this kind of beige color. There need to be, I think, 2 or 3 more rows of that, and then another black stripe. And then what I have to do is cast on stitches in each direction for the full length of the sleeves, and then I will be knitting each sleeve from wrist to wrist, and then I'll have to bind off for the back of the neck, and then I'll be doing each side as I'm adding stitches to the neck, and then I'll finish the sleeve, and then I'll continue the front, etc. So the thing is, I'm not really sure how long to make those sleeves, because I'm not just, knitting them down to the wrist. There is a cuff that will be there that will be crocheted, and then the fabric is going to be bloused. There's going to be slits, 5-inch long slits from the edge of the bottom of the sleeve coming up, and those will get sewn to a cuff here, and that will create some blousing. I don't know how much. I don't know if I just need to knit it as long as my sleeve is, and then by pushing it up 2 inches, if that will give it enough blousing, or if it needs to be longer than that. So all I know is it's going to have to be longer than what is in the pattern, because that was designed for a smaller person than I am. So I've been puzzling about how I'm going to solve that. And what I decided to do was a sort of a mock-up. I went to the fabric store and I bought just some gray knitted fabric. I wanted knitted fabric because I wanted it to be stretchy. So I wanted it to be able to stretch. It's not going to have the same exact weight as the sweater will, but it will have stretch to it. And I'm going to just do the back, and I'm going to make really long sleeves, and then I'll do the front separately. I can't do it all in one piece because the front is actually larger than the back. For the back, I eliminate 17 stitches across the back neck, but when I'm doing the V-neck, I'm adding in 18 stitches on each side, so it's going to create more blousing in the front. So I have to do them in 2 separate pieces, and I'll just sew the top seam. I'll show you when I actually do it. I'll show you what it ends up looking like. So I'll make the sleeves as long as I can, and then kind of get a sense of how much do they need to be pushed up in order to create that blousing, and then I'll be able to figure out how many stitches I need to cast on. So it might be, we'll see how far I get on that process. That's something I'll probably do this weekend. So someone asked me in the comments last week when I was showing this and I was holding it up on a straight needle, they were asking me why I was knitting it on straight needles. Was it, she thought it looked kind of quaint and wondered if I was just trying to keep in the spirit of vintage knitting to use straight needles. And there are a couple of reasons why I'm using straight needles. Number one is this is entirely in stockinette stitch, knit flat. And when I knit flat in stockinette stitch, I find I get the most even and most consistent fabric when I use straight needles. It's the way I first learned to knit 30 some years ago. And so when I have to knit something flat in stockinette, I prefer to use straights. The other reason is that because of the intarsia pattern, having to switch colors along the way, I have tried doing it when I knit continental, and I find it awkward. With intarsia knitting, you have a separate ball of yarn for each of the color sections. So you'd have one ball of yarn for this kind of beige color right here, and then one for the yellow, one for this section, one for that, all the way across. So I would have like 9, 10 or so balls of yarn when I'm working one of these. When I'm working the diagonal line ones like this, I'm able to use one ball of the beige and just have separate strands for each of the blue motifs. So what you do though, you knit across in the first color, and then when you get to the next color, you drop that yarn and you pick up the new color. But you don't just pick it up, you have to link those two colors together so you don't end up with a hole. Because when stockinette stitches are all in one color, they're all connected to each other with a running thread between the stitches. So if you have one color here and another color here, they're not connected right here. And so what you do is you link those two colors together when they meet, and that creates the running thread between them. So if I'm holding the yarn in my left hand and I come to a new color, I have to drop it and then link it and then get that back in my other hand. And I just find that awkward to do. And I prefer like to be working with the yarn in my right hand, and then it's just easier to drop one, pick the other one up with that same hand and then continue on. And the other reason is that when I knit flat in pure stockinette, no texture, that stockinette fabric shows any kind of irregularity in your tension, and I get pretty much perfect tension when I knit flat on these long straights. So anytime I'm doing intarsia, it's all stockinette, and it's not stranded color work, so there aren't other things that are helping or changing tension. It's very much, you can see every stitch and you can see exactly what was going on, and so I tend to knit flat on straights. When I started the Master Hand Knitting program, I was definitely still a thrower. And eventually I started learning continental methods and would use it for some things, but I continued to use my straights and throwing method for doing swatches because I knew that my tension would be absolutely perfect and those swatches were going to be judged by a committee. And by the time I got to level 3, I was fully a continental knitter with very rare exceptions. And one of those exceptions was the swatches for the Master Hand Knitting program, just because I could get such perfect tension every time without having to think about it, without focusing on it at all. It just would happen. So that is why I'm using straights. It's going to be a challenge when I have the sleeves on here. It'll be challenging until I bind off for the neck. And then I'll be working just one sleeve and one half of the front at a time, and then I'll come back to the other sleeve, finish that sleeve, and do that neck and front. And then by the time they join up again, the sleeves will be done. So there's going to be about a 5-inch period of knitting that everything's going to be really super crammed on the needles, but I'll just have to make do. One of the really nice things about knitting this Roaring 20s vintage sweater right now is that there's a Ravelry group called All Things Vintage. And so it's knitting and crochet, but sewing and all kinds, anything vintage. But they do a knit along or crochet along every 6 months. They do 2 of them a year, and they're each 6 months long. And each time they have some kind of a theme. And so they decided this year, or this January to June, would be Roaring Twenties, because it's the 2020s. Let's do some things from the 1920s. And it was perfect timing because I was planning on doing a 1920s sweater. And it was just a great way to make my decision and start moving forward on it. The really nice thing is that a lot of people are also knitting sweaters from the same booklet. They're not knitting the same sweater that I'm knitting, but they're knitting other things from that same booklet, which means a lot of them have patterns that are calling for the same yarn that mine is calling for, this Shetland floss. And so we've really kind of struggled to understand what it was. Some of the vintage yarn sites that you read, and they'll describe different brands and what those yarns are, and it would say that Shetland floss was a fingering weight yarn. And yet we could see from a variety of different patterns and where Shetland floss is used in different places, there are a huge range of gauges that it was knit in, and it didn't quite make sense. We were wondering, is it describing a type of yarn that comes in different yarn weights? That we just didn't quite know. And then there was, some discussion about, was Shetland floss something that even existed in the UK, or is that term an American invention? But it was a thing, because there was also imported Shetland floss. Corticelli Yarn Company that created the pattern book that I'm working from describes its floss Ola as a Shetland floss identical to imported Shetland floss. And then someone in the vintage group was posting ads from various UK, I think there were magazines, showing that they were advertising Shetland floss, Shetland floss. It wasn't just a synonym for the word yarn or wool, because they would be some places where they would be having a sale on Shetland wool and Shetland floss. So there's something different about, something specific about floss. There was one indication that maybe, because that apparently Shetland sheep have different wool qualities at different parts of their body, and maybe the Shetland floss was created from the wool from their neck, which was the softest. So perhaps that was one of the things. Then someone found that in the 1940s, the FTC, which is the Federal Trade Commission, said that you could not use like a place name in your product unless it actually came from that place. So you couldn't, and they gave examples like Saxony yarn, Spanish yarn, Berlin yarn, Shetland floss. They have all of these different, you can't call it that unless that's where it's actually from. So it's like false advertising. So I'm not sure what they ended up doing about that afterwards, because you could still find Shetland floss after that, but maybe it was always imported. I don't know. But that was interesting. And then somebody else found a description of Shetland floss in a knitting manual from somewhere in the middle of the century. And I got really excited about that. I'm like, what is this knitting manual? I've been looking for 20th century knitting manuals, because I can find the 19th century ones online. They've been digitized. But just trying to find a title for a knitting manual other than Mary Thomas's knitting book. If I have a title, then I can Google for it, I can search for it, and I know what I'm looking for. And then that will lead me to maybe other knitting books as well. So they gave me the clue of some books by a publisher in the UK called, I think it was called Odoms. And there are these two women who wrote, the first book came out in 1940. It was like something like Practical Knitting Illustrated, I think was the name of the book. And then there was a different book almost every year, except somewhere in the middle of the war, like 1943, there wasn't one, but there was like 40, 41, 42, 44, all the way up to like 1948 or 9. And they all had similar but different titles, like Modern Knitting or The Complete Family Knitting Book or Garments for All, things like that by these two women. And so I found, okay, that is a lead on some manuals, and I found all 8 of them from different sellers in the UK. One of them I found here in the US, that very first one. And so this past weekend I was buying these books. And then I found a couple other books once I found where I could find these books, I found Abe Books has them, and then I learned how to search for them on Abe Books, and how to find other knitting books. And I found a couple. I don't know how many books I bought, 8 or 10 books maybe. And most of them are getting shipped from the UK. And I think the ones that are here in the US might arrive here sometime maybe next week or the week after, but they're just gradually, like the ship dates, like the arrival dates are expected. One of them is like, it will be here by the end of April, but they have a kind of a long window of how long shipping can take. So I'm expecting that every week or so between now and the end of April, I'll be getting a vintage book, and I will share those with you to show you what kinds of things are in there, because I'm really interested to know what techniques they taught and what they thought of as best practices. And it's really interesting to me, so I'm looking forward to that. In the meantime, somebody else in the group, when we were discussing the Shetland floss bit, she said, "Oh, look, I found on eBay, I found some vintage Shetland floss for sale." And I was like, "Oh my God." I hated the color. I didn't care. I just said, "Are you going to buy it? If you don't buy it, I'm going to buy it." And I went and I looked at the listing, and it was sold already. So I thought she had bought it. She said, "Oh no, I didn't buy it. It was an old thing. Somebody had bought and sold it a while ago." So I went back on eBay and I'm looking for vintage Shetland floss, and I found some, and it came yesterday, and I'm super excited. The thing about these old yarns is they usually came in 1 ounce balls, but they don't tell you how many yards are in them. So I started swatching with them, both as 1 strand and 2 strands, and then I'm comparing them to some worsted spun yarns, which is more like a regular sock yarn, which is very smooth 4-ply yarn that's hard wearing and dense, compared to this Shetland floss, which is a woolen spun yarn, and so it's much airier than a worsted spun yarn. Worsted spun yarns are so much more common today. I don't think I've ever even knit with a woolen spun yarn that I was aware of. And part of that is because I knit socks, so the fingering weight yarns I buy are suitable for socks. And secondly is I knit a lot of sweaters with texture and cables, which are really good with worsted spun yarns. And worsted spun yarns tend to be what the main, like, common yarn every yarn company has, like Cascade 220 is a worsted spun yarn. And so when I'm comparing yarns and I'm looking at a worsted weight wool, I always look at the yardage and I say, oh, 220 yards, that's just exact. That'd be a good substitute for Cascade 220 or LRA or whatever. And I've always assumed that if there was more yardage, that meant the yarn was thinner, and if there's less yardage, it meant it was thicker. But that's not true when it comes to woolen spun yarns. With woolen spun yarns, there's more air in them, and so there's actually more yardage, even though they're the same thickness. But they also allow you to work them in a wider range of gauges, which is what this Shetland floss, that was the thing that was puzzling everybody, is that you can knit them, at a fingering weight gauge, or you can knit them at a looser gauge, and they'll have more body to them than a worsted spun yarn. Worsted spun yarns have more drape. They don't pill as much. They're harder wearing, but they're not as warm. They're more wind resistant and water resistant, but they're not as warm. So each type of spinning has its advantages and disadvantages, but I've never had a use for one in my own knitting. I think some items could be knit in either one and be just fine. But I think these days we just don't have as many woolen spun yarns. But the other thing that kept coming up when we were thinking maybe Shetland floss applied to different yarn weights is that I was noticing over and over and over the word zephyr appearing in different yarns. And those really were of different yarn weights. And when I knit this sweater, it called for Germantown Zephyr 4-ply. And I'd heard of Germantown 4-ply knitting worsted. Germantown is in Pennsylvania, and they were known for knitting high quality knitting yarns. So every yarn company had a Germantown yarn of some sort. So I knew Germantown 4-ply was a worsted weight yarn, but then this was calling for Germantown Zephyr, and I looked it up and it was also shown as a worsted weight yarn. I just didn't understand the difference. I just used the worsted weight yarn I had in my stash. It worked just fine, but I was starting to wonder if that was indicating woolen spun, if that's what Zephyr was referring to. I'm like, what does Zephyr even mean? Well, Zephyr was the Greek god of the west wind. So that was the gentlest wind. It was the one that comes in the spring. It's warm and light. It's a light breeze, warm light breeze. And I'm like, okay, that's a perfect description of a woolen yarn. It's light, literally lighter in weight. For every, yard or meter of a woolen spun yarn, it's going to weigh less than a worsted spun yarn. It's going to have less fiber because there's going to be more air in it. It's going to be light and it's going to be warm. So I'm like, okay, that must be what Zephyr means. And so I was looking it up online. There are couple of yarns that are called Zephyr. Jagerspun has one, or Jagerspun has one called Zephyr something or other. And it's a 50-50 Tussa silk wool blend. And then there's a company called, I think it's called Argyle Sheep, that sells a yarn that is like 55% Texas wool and 45% California cotton. And they specifically say in there that it's a woolen spun and that that refers to it's light and airy. So, so that was an interesting revelation to make because there's never any indication on these vintage yarn conversion charts that there's a difference in how the yarn is spun. And I think that's an important thing when you're going to make a yarn substitution. It's hard enough with the vintage yarns to figure out what yarn weight was something or what kind of yarn was this. But the woolen and worsted spun, I think makes more of a difference with vintage because it seems like there were way more woolen spun yarns back then than we have now. So then one more thing that we were learning about with the vintage yarns, because we had been discussing this Zephyr business, the woman who, I think it was the same woman who found the eBay listing and then talked about the FTC proclamation about place names associated with yarns. She was just in a charity shop in the UK, I think the other day, and she came across this vintage yarn. It said it was Peyton's White Heather Zephyr 4-ply single. And she's like, I wonder if this Zephyr if this is what we were talking about before. And so we were asking about the qualities of it, do you think it could be a woolen spun? She's like, I don't know, how do I tell? And but she was interested in what does it mean by single? What does that 4-ply single mean? And I said, oh, interesting, because DK yarn, DK for double knitting, refers to the fact that you could, it's the same as if you use 2 strands of fingering weight yarn, you could use that to create a DK or a double knitting yarn. But I had never seen a yarn, a fingering weight or a 4-ply, as they call it. I'd never heard of it referred to as single. So that was really interesting. It used to be that each strand of applied yarn was exactly the same. So if you had a single, that would be cobweb. That's the same as cobweb yarn. If you had 2 plies, it would be lace weight, and then the 4 plies is the fingering weight or the single. And you could keep adding them up, and there are countries like Australia still uses that ply system as their weight designation. So they would say an 8-ply yarn. They wouldn't even say DK, I don't think. They would say 8-ply. Even if it has one single, or if it's 2-ply, however many actual physical plies it has, they'll call it an 8-ply if it's a DK weight yarn. So I learned a lot in this past week about vintage knitting books and vintage yarns, and I never ever thought I would buy any vintage yarn. I used to think, why would anybody buy vintage yarn? Why would you want to buy yarn that was 80 years old? That just doesn't make any sense. But I did it, and I'm really happy about it, and I'm really excited about my swatching. So I'll be sharing some of that in the next few weeks, what I've discovered. Oh, I had one more question relating to this sweater. Somebody was asking me if I could do a video on how I weave the ends in for something like this, particularly on those bits where I have the blue V's and the black diagonals where they're only like 1 or 2 stitches wide. She was wondering how I handled that. And I do have a different technique that I use for weaving in ends in that situation than I do for when I weave in with a kind of a block of knitting like I have right here. So I've done a number of videos on weaving in ends, but I haven't done one that on the technique that I am using on the blue V's and the black diagonals. So when I actually weave these ends in, I'll do a video on that. It should be sometime soon. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below or join the discussion in my Ravelry group. Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.